Picture this. It's the early hours of Sunday, February 22nd, 2026.
Okay.
We are in Tapalpa, Mexico. And if you've never been, you have to picture this incredibly picturesque mountain town.
Yeah, it's known for those artisan shops, the quiet cobblestone streets.
Exactly. Lush green peaks all around. It's the kind of place you go to escape the noise of the world.
Right.
But tucked away in a forest cabin complex just on the outskirts of this tourist retreat is a man with a $5 million U.S. bounty on his head.
Which is just a staggering amount of money.
It is. And this is an individual so elusive, so utterly secretive, that the world really only had these grainy black and white photographs of him from arrests back in the 1980s.
Nobody even knew what he looked like today.
Okay. Until now. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're unpacking an explosive new document titled El Mencho is Dead. The system that built him isn't.
It is a phenomenal breakdown. We're looking at the comprehensive architecture of how a deported, low-level dealer managed to build a $20 billion paramilitary empire.
Wow.
And more importantly, we are examining how decades of systemic policy failures across multiple governments really practically laid down the red carpet for that empire to be built in the first place.
Yeah, so our mission today is to explore the sheer scale of this organization, the mechanics of how it was constructed, and the really intense fallout of its leader's demise.
Exactly.
Now, before we jump into the timeline of the capture, I do need to make something very clear to you listening. The source material we are working with today contains some highly politically charged claims regarding the policies and histories of both the United States and Mexican governments.
Very charged.
Right. So we are not taking sides or endorsing the viewpoints of this content. We are simply here to impartially report and convey the ideas contained in the original source material.
The goal here is synthesis. We want to take these dense geopolitical and historical events and map them out so you can really understand the broader economic context the material provides.
Perfect. So let's start with the capture itself. Catching a ghost takes patience, and the breakthrough finally arrived on February 20th. Mexican intelligence managed to track an associate of one of El Mencho's romantic partners.
And that associate essentially led the authorities right to this secluded rural property just outside Tapalpa.
Yeah. Then on February 21st, the partner leaves the location, but he stays behind with his personal security detail. And that was the window Mexican forces had been waiting literally years to open.
The scale of the operation that followed was massive. But the tactical approach is really what stands out here.
How so?
Well, before dawn, on February 22nd, a joint task force moves in. We're talking Special Forces, the National Guard, the Air Force, the Army.
Wow.
But to maintain the absolute element of surprise against a target this high profile, they relied almost entirely on ground forces. They severely limited their helicopter support.
Because if they hear choppers.
Exactly. The moment you put choppers in the air, cartel lookouts miles away hit their radios, and the target just vanishes.
That makes sense. But even with that ground-level surprise, it was not a quiet arrest. As the soldiers approached the compound, the cartel's gunmen opened fire. A massive shootout breaks out in the forest.
And 4 cartel members died in that initial exchange.
Right. El Mencho actually attempts to flee deeper into the cabin complex, but after a second heavy exchange of gunfire, he is captured. He sustained severe wounds during the firefight, and ultimately he died from his injuries while being airlifted to a medical facility in Mexico City.
And former DEA officials were immediately calling this one of the most significant actions in the history of global drug trafficking.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to understand why the death of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes is such a massive global event, we have to look at his wildly unlikely beginnings.
The contrast between where he ended up and where he started is staggering. He was born in 1966 in Aguililla, Michoacán. We were talking about absolute extreme poverty.
Right.
His family farmed avocados in a region heavily dominated by illegal marijuana plantations. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade just to help his family survive.
5th grade. And by the time he was 14 years old, he had already transitioned from farming avocados to guarding marijuana fields.
Yeah.
It really highlights the utter lack of economic alternatives in that region at the time. Guarding illicit crops wasn't a career ambition, it was basic survival.
Exactly. But then, in the 1980s, he makes a move. He heads to California, chasing the American dream.
Which didn't pan out.
No, he didn't find it. He ended up falling right back into the only economy he knew. By 1986, he is arrested in San Francisco for possessing stolen property and a loaded gun.
And then again in 1992, he is caught selling heroin to undercover cops. He serves his time, and in 1997, at 30 years old, he gets deported back to Mexico.
He's just a low-level dealer kicked out of the U.S.
Right. Which brings us to a deeply ironic turn in his trajectory. Back in Mexico, this deported, convicted felon gets a new job.
He becomes a police officer.
You genuinely cannot write this stuff. It sounds like a rejected movie script.
It was a very harsh reality, because that stint in law enforcement served as his absolute masterclass in corruption. He wasn't just patrolling the streets. He was getting a profound inside look at the architecture of the state. He learned the exact price of a bribe. He learned how radio networks operated, how patrols were scheduled, and most importantly, where the structural weaknesses of the government were located.
And he weaponized that knowledge.
Complete.
So while he's gathering all this insider knowledge, he marries Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia. This is a massive turning point because she comes from a highly influential cartel family.
This marriage is his entry ticket into organized crime at a much higher strategic level.
Right. He starts working as a bodyguard and a hitman for her family's organization, the Milenio Cartel. Fast forward to 2010. The Milenio Cartel has taken a beating. Their leaders are either killed or locked up.
So Mencho steps up.
Yeah, he steps up and essentially demands to be recognized as the new leader. They refuse. So he takes his loyalists, breaks away entirely, and forms his own organization, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or the CJNG.
And that breakaway sets the stage for a defining moment in how this new cartel operated. By May 2015, the Mexican military launches Operation Jalisco specifically to capture him.
And they did not back down.
The CJNG did not respond like a traditional street gang. When the military moved in, the cartel fought back with RPG-27 rocket launchers and heavy machine guns.
They literally shot down a military helicopter.
Yes. Out of the 18 personnel on board, only 9 survived.
We are talking about anti-tank weapons being fired at military aircraft within domestic borders. That is an act of war.
It was a level of direct, militarized confrontation with the state that the region hadn't seen since the height of Pablo Escobar's violent campaigns in Colombia.
Unbelievable.
And the cartel didn't stop at the helicopter. They set fire to dozens of buses, commercial trucks, and gas stations across multiple regions to create chaos and physically block troop movement.
The government had to respond.
They were forced to deploy 10,000 troops just to regain basic control of the area. It became undeniable that the CJNG was functioning as a heavily armed paramilitary force.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because you don't fund a paramilitary force equipped with rocket launchers just by selling avocados or even marijuana.
No, you do not.
You need serious, unprecedented capital. And that brings us to their actual business model, which was entirely built on 2 chemicals, methamphetamine and fentanyl.
The scale of their logistical network is difficult to comprehend. By 2019, the DEA estimated that 1/3 of all drugs entering the United States by land or sea were controlled solely by the CJNG.
1/3.
Yes, and by 2018, they were operating over 100 major meth labs across Mexico.
The reason they went so heavy into synthetics is all about profit margins and control. With traditional drugs like cocaine or heroin, you have to rely on agricultural cycles, the weather, and you have to rely on Colombian suppliers.
But meth and fentanyl, they could manufacture it themselves entirely. All they needed were precursor chemicals.
And precursor chemicals aren't illegal drugs themselves. They are everyday industrial chemicals used in legitimate manufacturing, which makes stopping their flow from China through commercial ports nearly impossible.
The CJNG even seized control of the port of Manzanillo in Mexico.
Which is huge.
Massive. That gave them a strategic, state-level access point to manage their entire chemical supply chain from the moment a cargo ship arrived to the moment the finished product headed north.
The analysis estimates this built them a war chest exceeding $20 billion.
$20 billion allows an organization to buy immense political influence and military-grade weaponry. But while meth built their war chest, fentanyl became the product that defined their future and the world's current crisis.
Yeah.
Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid 50 times more powerful than heroin. The potency is lethal. Just 2 milligrams, which looks like a few tiny grains of sand, is enough to kill a human being.
The economics of fentanyl broken down in the text are staggering. If you look at this purely as a business venture, it is chillingly efficient. It costs the cartel about 10 cents to manufacture a single fentanyl pill.
10 cents.
10 cents. They then sell that pill in the United States for anywhere from $10 to $30.
Wow.
So an initial production investment of just $500 can yield a return of $20 million.
It's just hard to wrap your head around that math.
If you compare that to a legitimate tech startup's ROI, it's astronomical.
Hmm.
There's virtually no legal business on Earth that offers that kind of economic gravitational pull.
But the human cost of that profit margin is devastating. In 2023, approximately 73,000 drug overdose deaths in the U.S. were attributed to synthetic opioids, with fentanyl responsible for 70% of them.
It is wiping out entire communities. The material highlights that this crisis touches everyone, noting high-profile tragedies like travel creator Ananya Sood, whose death was linked to an accidental fentanyl overdose.
It really puts a human face on the statistics.
Does. These are everyday people getting caught in the crossfire of a massive, ruthless supply chain.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to ask how a cartel gets powerful enough to operate hundreds of labs, control major international shipping ports, and challenge the national military in open combat.
Right. How does that happen?
The root cause points directly to decades of systemic political failures.
Yeah, at the local level, the text describes a brutal system of coercion known as plata or plomo silver or lead. We are talking about rural mayors or local police chiefs making modest civil servant salaries, suddenly being confronted by heavily armed men.
Yeah.
They are handed a briefcase of cash and a gun and told to choose how they want to end their night. Take the bribe or take a bullet.
It's an impossible choice that plays out in hundreds of municipalities.
Exactly.
But that local corruption was born from a much older national architecture. For 71 years, Mexico was governed by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI.
Right.
Under their rule, what's known as the Plaza system emerged. You could call it a managed peace, but really it was a state-sponsored extortion racket. The government wasn't fighting organized crime, they were regulating it.
They basically managed the territories.
Yes, the cartels were allowed to operate their territories or plazas as long as they paid their bribes, kept the violence away from the public eye, and never threatened political officials.
But the problem with regulating crime is that when the regulators lose power, which the PRI did in the year 2000, the whole market violently deregulates. The rules disappeared overnight.
Exactly.
Chaos. Then in 2006, President Felipe Calderón declared an all-out military war on the cartels, deploying thousands of soldiers. With U.S. intelligence help, they captured or killed 25 of the top 37 drug kingpins.
But there's a fatal flaw in that kingpin strategy.
Right. When you remove a kingpin, you don't destroy the cartel, you just create a massive power vacuum. Those vacuums gave birth to dozens of smaller, incredibly violent factions all fighting for the throne, multiplying the bloodshed.
And then jumping forward to 2018, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador tries the exact opposite approach.
Hugs, not bullets.
Yes. He introduces the Hugs Not Bullets policy, aiming to focus on poverty and unemployment, the root drivers that push young men into the cartels. But the implementation of this strategy also failed to curb the violence. The cartels simply used the breathing room to expand.
And the critique of systemic failures extends far beyond the Mexican border.
Yeah.
A deeply troubling dimension to this crisis is that while Americans are dying from these drugs, the U.S. government has historically enacted policies that actively fueled the fire.
Let's look at the historical U.S. actions outlined here. First, we go back to the 1980s with the CIA.
Right.
The CIA was supporting the Contra rebels fighting the socialist government in Nicaragua. The funding and training for those rebels were actually facilitated by Mexican drug cartels.
Which is just crazy to think about.
It was later exposed that the CIA utilized the ranch of one of Mexico's biggest drug lords, Rafael Caro Quintero, to physically train those rebels. By leaning on the cartels for geopolitical goals, the U.S. essentially armed and strengthened the very organizations it is now spending billions to fight.
And then consider the massive economic impact of the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. While it successfully reduced trade restrictions, it inadvertently opened a superhighway for drug smuggling. Daily commercial truck crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border jumped from 7,500 to 12,000.
From a purely logistical standpoint, it became physically impossible for customs agents to inspect every vehicle without bringing international trade to a standstill.
But NAFTA had another massive unintended side effect. It allowed incredibly cheap, subsidized American agricultural crops to flood the Mexican market. The price of Mexican corn dropped by 65%.
Wow.
This economic shock devastated 2 million Mexican farmers who simply couldn't compete. With their generational livelihoods destroyed, many of those farmers had no choice but to enter the illicit economy.
It created a perfect, desperate recruiting pool for the cartels, driven entirely by international trade policy.
Finally, we have to address the flow of weapons. This is the literal firepower that sustains the cartels. Between 2014 and 2018, 70% of the firearms recovered at crime scenes in Mexico were of American origin.
There are currently 6,700 licensed gun dealers in the border region alone.
The Mexican government estimates that 200,000 firearms are smuggled from the U.S. into Mexico every single year. It is an iron river flowing south.
And the text highlights one specific, mind-boggling failure: Operation Fast and Furious.
Right.
U.S. agencies intentionally allowed 2,000 weapons to cross the border into Mexico. The plan was to track them to criminal leaders, but they lost track of the weapons.
They just lost them.
The guns vanished into the cartel ecosystem and were later used in crimes that killed both Americans and Mexicans.
It is a cyclical nightmare of policy failures. Which brings us back to the immediate aftermath of El Mencho's death in 2026. If history tells us removing a kingpin creates a violent vacuum, the CJNG's immediate response proved it on a terrifying scale.
Yeah, following his death, a senior leader known as El Mencho's right-hand man ordered massive coordinated attacks across 20 different starts.
He put a bounty of 2,000 Mexican pesos, which is roughly $100 on the head of every single Mexican soldier.
Just $100.
For $100, they were incentivizing open war on the national military, showing utter contempt for state authority.
The cartel torched vehicles, blocked highways with over 250 roadblocks, destroyed businesses, and forced schools to shut down.
Guadalajara, Mexico's second-largest city, was essentially paralyzed and turned into a ghost town.
Security analysts compared the sheer scale of the chaos directly to 1980s Colombia, when Pablo Escobar waged an open, urban war against the state.
The internal future of the CJNG is now deeply uncertain, primarily because El Mencho's succession line has been systematically dismantled over the years.
Right. His son is sitting in a U.S. prison. His wife was arrested for money laundering back in 2021. His brothers are currently in Mexican jails.
So without a clear heir, a massive violent power struggle among the remaining regional cartel commanders is all but guaranteed.
Meanwhile, the U.S. response has escalated dramatically. The U.S. government officially designated the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations.
Which is a huge shift.
It is. The text details a severe military initiative from late 2025 called Operation Southern Spear, where the American military began bombing suspected drug trafficking vessels in international waters.
This was done without trials or evidence presentations.
And it resulted in at least 150 deaths. Tragically, those casualties included civilian fishermen who were simply caught in the crossfire of this massive escalation.
This raises an important question. How does the current Mexican administration handle this intense pressure?
The burden falls squarely on Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. The killing of El Mencho is undeniably a significant tactical victory for her administration.
Definitely.
However, she now faces a diplomatic nightmare. She has to demonstrate to the world that Mexico can manage the resulting cartel fallout without allowing American military intervention directly on Mexican soil.
Because the history outlined in this analysis is incredibly clear. When one drug lord falls, the systemic conditions ensure that others immediately rise to take his place.
The overarching conclusion is that the solution has to reach far deeper than any single arrest or any single military airstrike.
The cycle is fed from all sides. As long as the demand for synthetic drugs in the United States remains extraordinarily high, there will always be an organization in Mexico willing to supply it.
Right.
And as long as American guns continue to flood south across the border and Chinese precursor chemicals continue to feed the clandestine labs, the machinery of the cartels will keep running.
It isn't just a Mexican problem, and it isn't just an American problem.
No, it is a shared transnational crisis that demands a truly shared international solution.
The clock is ticking on an international stage. We're left with a chilling reminder. In June 2026, the FIFA World Cup is scheduled to host matches right in the heart of CJNG territory.
Wow.
It's a stark, unavoidable showcase of the immense grip these organizations still hold over the region, even with their supreme leader gone.
It really puts everything into perspective. The story of El Mencho is the story of a man who held a massive portion of a country in his grip. But more importantly, it's a glaring siren about what happens when transnational crime, deeply rooted corruption, and decades of failed geopolitical policies are allowed to collide year after year without anyone truly willing to address the root causes.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with a final thought to consider. If traditional government policies like taking out the kingpin consistently result in multiplying the violence rather than ending it, do we need to fundamentally redefine what winning looks like?
Yeah.
If you are a global policymaker preparing for the World Cup in this territory, do you still treat these cartels merely as localized crime waves? Or do you have to confront the uncomfortable reality that they are functioning as an unofficial sovereign state?
It's a heavy question.
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning the systems around you. We'll catch you next time.